They called me a failure, kicked me out of my own home, and years later I came back, not to beg, but as the owner of their house. The boy who was never enough begins in a quiet home where love was never loud and approval was always distant, and from a very young age I understood something that no child should ever have to understand, that I was not enough. I was not the son my father wanted, I was not the child my mother proudly talked about, and I was definitely not the brother who could stand beside the golden image that my older brother had become in our family. My brother was everything they admired. He was confident, smart, successful, and praised by everyone around him. While I existed in the same house yet felt invisible, every achievement of his became a reminder of my failure. Every compliment he received felt like a silent comparison thrown directly at me, and I learned to stay quiet because every time I tried to speak about my dreams or my ideas, I was shut down before I could even finish a sentence. My father had a habit of looking at me with disappointment. Even when I tried my best, he would shake his head and say nothing, which somehow hurt more than words because silence carried judgment that words could not fully express. My mother was softer in tone, but her eyes always revealed the truth. She expected more from me, yet never believed I could actually become more, and that silent disbelief slowly carved out deep into my heart. Growing up in such an environment changes a person in ways that are not always visible on the outside. I became someone who questioned every decision, someone who hesitated before speaking, someone who feared trying because failure was already expected of me, and somehow I started believing them. I started believing that maybe I was just average, maybe I was just someone who would never rise above expectations, maybe I was born to stand in the shadow of others. While my brother moved forward in life collecting achievements and recognition, I stayed behind trying to figure out who I even was. Family gatherings were the hardest moments because that was when comparisons became public. Relatives would gather around praising my brother, talking about his future, his career, his bright path ahead, and then their attention would slowly turn toward me with polite smiles and curious questions about what I planned to do with my life, and I never had a confident answer because every time I thought about my future, I heard my father's voice telling me I could not succeed. I heard my brother's laughter when I shared an idea. I heard my mother's quiet sigh that carried more disappointment than words ever could, so I would simply smile and give vague responses, trying to avoid the uncomfortable silence that followed my lack of direction. But inside I felt small, I felt lost, I felt like I was already failing at a race that I had barely started yet. Despite everything, there was still a part of me that wanted to prove them wrong, a small fragile voice inside me that whispered that I could do something different, that I could build something of my own, something that did not require their approval or their validation. And one day I gathered the courage to speak about it. I told them I wanted to start a small online business. It was not a huge dream, it was not something unrealistic, it was just a simple idea that gave me hope. But the reaction I received crushed that hope instantly. My father laughed in a way that made it clear he did not take me seriously at all. He told me I could not even manage my own life, and here I was talking about running a business. My brother joined in with a smirk that felt sharper than any insult. He told me to stop dreaming because people like me do not get lucky, and my mother did not defend me. She did not encourage me. She simply looked away as if she had already accepted that I would never achieve anything meaningful in life. That moment stayed with me because it was not just about rejection, it was about being dismissed completely, as if my efforts, my ideas, and my existence did not carry any weight in that house. Over time, I stopped sharing my thoughts, I stopped expressing my ambitions. I became quieter, more reserved, more distant, not because I wanted to, but because it felt safer to remain unnoticed than to be constantly reminded of my shortcomings. By the age of 22, I had fully accepted the role they had given me, the failure, the disappointment, the one who would never make it. I lived in that house, but I did not feel at home. I existed among people who were supposed to support me, yet they only highlighted my flaws and ignored my potential, and that kind of environment slowly drains the life out of a person. It makes you question your worth, it makes you doubt your abilities, it makes you believe that maybe they are right, maybe you are not capable of achieving anything significant. But deep down beneath all the doubt and fear, there was still a quiet determination forming, something that even I did not fully understand at the time, because when you are constantly told that you are nothing, you either accept it completely or you start building something inside yourself that refuses to stay nothing. And I did not realize it then, but every insult, every comparison, every moment of neglect was shaping me in ways they could not see, because while they were busy labeling me as a failure, I was slowly learning how to survive without their approval, how to endure without their support, and how to keep going even when no one believed in me. And that silent growth would one day become my greatest strength, because failures learn lessons that success often hides. They learn resilience, they learn patience, they learn how to stand alone. And although I still felt lost and uncertain about my future, there was one thing I knew for sure: I would not stay the same forever. Because somewhere deep inside the boy who was never enough was beginning to change, and that change would one day prove that everything they believed about me was wrong. The day I lost everything begins on a heavy evening filled with rain and silence, where the sky itself seemed to carry the same weight that was sitting inside my chest. I had just walked back from another failed job interview. My clothes were wet, my shoes were covered in mud, and my mind was filled with the same exhausting thoughts that had followed me for years, that I was not good enough, that no matter how hard I tried, something always fell apart before it could even begin. And as I stood outside the house for a moment before entering, I felt a strange hesitation, as if something inside me already knew that this night would not be like any other night. I slowly opened the door and stepped in quietly, trying not to draw attention to myself, but before I could move further, I heard voices coming from the living room, voices that were familiar yet carried a tone I had never fully faced before. My father, my mother, and my brother were talking, and I was not meant to hear what they were saying, but I froze in place as my name came up in their conversation. My brother spoke first, his voice calm yet sharp in a way that cut deeper than anger ever could. He said that I was useless, that I was doing nothing with my life, and that I was only taking up space in the house. And for a moment I told myself to walk away, to pretend I had heard nothing, but my feet would not move. I stood there listening as my father responded, and instead of defending me, he agreed without hesitation. He said they had already done enough for me, and that it was time I faced reality, that I could not keep depending on them forever. And then came the words that shattered whatever fragile hope I still held onto. My mother spoke softly, but her words carried the heaviest weight. She said that maybe I was just not meant for anything big, and in that moment something inside me broke completely. It was not anger, it was not even sadness, it was a deep, hollow feeling, as if every belief I had about family, about support, about unconditional love had suddenly disappeared. I felt empty yet overwhelmed at the same time, and without thinking I walked into the room. My presence startled them, and the conversation stopped instantly. The silence that followed was suffocating, and for the first time in my life I did not lower my eyes or stay quiet. I looked at them and asked them to say it to my face. My voice was not loud, but it carried a firmness that surprised even me. My father stood up slowly, his expression serious and unyielding, and he said exactly what I had heard, that I was a disappointment. There was no hesitation in his voice, no attempt to soften the impact of his words. It was direct and final, as if he had already made up his mind about me long ago. And then he added something that changed everything. He told me that if I could not stand on my own feet, then I should not stay under his roof. Those words echoed in my mind long after he said them, because they were not spoken in anger, they were spoken as a decision, and that made them even more painful. There was no argument, no shouting, no attempt to fix things. It was simply over. In that moment I realized that I was not just being criticized, I was being pushed out of the only place I had ever known as home. And what hurt the most was not just what was said, but what was not said. No one stopped him, no one disagreed, no one even looked surprised. It was as if they had all accepted this outcome long before it actually happened. I stood there for a few seconds trying to process everything, but there was nothing left to say, because any words I could have spoken would not change how they saw me. So I turned away quietly and walked to my room. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if I was leaving behind something much bigger than just a physical space. I packed my bag slowly, taking only what I needed, because deep down I knew I was not coming back. I paused for a moment, looking around the room that had been mine for years yet never truly felt like mine, and I realized that there were no memories here that I wanted to hold on to, no moments of warmth, no sense of belonging, just a collection of days filled with doubt and silence and disappointment. When I stepped out of the room, no one came after me, no one asked where I was going, no one tried to stop me, and that silence confirmed everything I needed to know. I walked out of the house into the rain, and as the door closed behind me, it felt like a chapter of my life had ended completely, but not in a dramatic way, not with tears or shouting, but with a quiet finality that was far more painful. The rain soaked through my clothes, but I did not care, because the cold outside felt nothing compared to the emptiness inside. I walked without direction for a long time, not knowing where I would go or what I would do next, because for the first time in my life I truly had nothing, no plan, no support, no place to call home. And eventually I found myself at a bus stop. The streets were almost empty, and the dim lights around me flickered as if they were struggling to stay on. Just like I was, I sat down on the cold bench, holding my bag close, trying to make sense of everything that had just happened. My mind replayed their words over and over again. Useless, disappointment, not meant for anything big. And with each repetition the pain grew heavier, but somewhere within that pain something else began to form, something unfamiliar, something stronger than the fear and doubt that had defined me for so long. Because When you lose everything, you are left with only two choices. You either break completely or you start building something new from nothing. And as I sat there in the cold, lonely night, I realized that there was nothing left for me to lose, and that realization brought a strange sense of freedom, because if no one believed in me, then I no longer had to live up to their expectations. If I had already been labeled a failure, then there was no fear in trying anymore, because failure was no longer something to avoid. It was something I had already survived, and for the first time in my life, I was not trying to prove myself to anyone else. I was simply trying to survive, and that shift changed something deep inside me. The pain was still there, the betrayal still hurt, the loneliness still weighed on me, but beneath all of it there was a quiet determination beginning to rise, because even though I had been pushed out, even though I had been rejected by the people who were supposed to stand by me, I was still here, still breathing, still capable of moving forward, and that was enough for now. That night at the bus stop marked the lowest point of my life, but it also marked the beginning of something new, something uncertain, something difficult, but something that belonged entirely to me, because for the first time I was not living under their expectations or their judgments. I was standing alone in the world with nothing but my will to keep going in. Although I did not know it yet, that moment of losing everything would one day become the reason I gained everything. The rise they never saw coming begins in a place of struggle, where every day felt uncertain and every night carried the weight of exhaustion. But unlike before, this struggle was different, because it was mine. I was no longer living under judgment or comparison. I was living in reality, a harsh, unforgiving reality where survival depended only on my own effort and decisions. The first few months after leaving home were the hardest time of my life. I had no stable place to stay, no clear plan, and no one to rely on. I moved from one temporary shelter to another, sometimes sleeping at bus stations, sometimes finding a corner in storage rooms where I worked part-time jobs just to get through the night. I took any work I could find, cleaning tables, carrying boxes, delivering packages, doing tasks that most people would ignore without a second thought, and every coin I earned felt like a small victory, because it meant I could eat for another day. It meant I could keep going. But the physical struggle was only part of the challenge. The real battle was happening inside my mind, because the voices from my past did not disappear. They followed me, reminding me of every insult, every doubt, every word that labeled me as a failure. And there were moments when I almost believed them again. Moments when I questioned whether they were right about me, whether I truly was incapable of building anything meaningful. But each time that thought appeared, something inside me resisted, something refused to accept that this was all my life would ever be. And slowly that resistance turned into determination. I began to realize that I had nothing left to protect, no reputation, no expectations, no fear of failure, because I had already experienced the worst kind of rejection and survived it. And that realization gave me a strange kind of strength, of freedom to try without worrying about what others would think, because there was no one left to judge me except myself. And with that mindset, I decided to take a small risk, something simple, something manageable. I started an online reselling idea. It was not a grand business plan. It was just a small attempt to create something of my own. I used the little money I had saved to buy inexpensive products and tried to sell them online with basic descriptions and pictures. At first, nothing happened. Days passed without a single order, and each failure felt like a confirmation of what my family had always believed. But this time I did not stop. I studied what I was doing wrong. I learned about marketing, about presentation, about how people think when they decide to buy something. I spent nights researching instead of sleeping, trying to understand how to improve, even when I was exhausted from working all day. And slowly things began to change. My first sale came unexpectedly. It was small, but it meant everything to me, because it proved that someone out there was willing to pay for something I offered. And that one sale gave me hope. Then came another, and then another. Each step was small, but together they started forming a path that I could follow. I reinvested every bit of profit back into the business, growing it slowly, carefully, learning from every mistake and adapting to every challenge. I faced setbacks, of course. There were many shipments, failed products that did not sell, days when I felt like giving up. But each time I remembered the night I left home, the words that pushed me out, the feeling of being unwanted. And instead of breaking me, those memories fueled me. They reminded me of why I started and why I could not afford to stop. As time passed, my understanding improved, my strategies became better, and my confidence began to grow, not because someone encouraged me, but because I could see the results of my own efforts. Within a year, I was no longer just surviving. I was making a steady income. Within 2 years, I had built something stable, something real, something that belonged entirely to me. And for the first time in my life, I felt proud, not because someone praised me, but because I knew how far I had come. From that cold night at the bus stop, and then something unexpected happened. People who once ignored me started noticing my progress. Old contacts reached out. Relatives who never cared suddenly showed interest in my life. They spoke to me differently now, with respect, with curiosity, with a tone that suggested they had always believed in me, but I knew the truth. I knew where they stood when I had nothing, and I did not hold anger toward them because I had learned something important along the way. Success changes how people see you, but it does not change who they truly are, and instead of confronting them, I simply accepted their words without giving them the satisfaction of believing they had always supported me. Because my journey was not about proving them right, it was about proving myself capable, and even as my business grew and my life became more stable, there was still a part of me that remained connected to my past, not in a painful way, but as a reminder of how far I had come, and that reminder led me to think about the one place that had shaped so much of my life, the house where I grew up, the house where I was called a failure, the house I was forced to leave behind. For years I avoided thinking about it because it carried memories I did not want to relive, but one day while browsing through property listings out of simple curiosity, I saw something that stopped me completely. It was that house, the same house from my past, listed for sale, and for a moment everything around me felt still, my mind filled with images of my childhood, the moments of silence, the words of disappointment, the feeling of being invisible, and I stared at the screen trying to process what I was seeing, because this was more than just a property. It was a symbol of everything I had been through, everything I had survived, and everything I had overcome. And as I sat there thinking about it, I realized something that changed the way I saw my entire journey. I was no longer the person who had been pushed out. I was no longer the boy who had nothing. I was someone who had built a life from the ground up, someone who had turned rejection into strength and failure into growth, and that realization brought a quiet confidence that I had never felt before, because it was not based on external validation. It was built on my own experiences, my own struggles, and my own victories. And in that moment I understood that my story was not just about success, it was about transformation. It was about taking everything that was meant to break me and using it to build something stronger. And as I looked at the listing of that house, I felt a mix of emotions, not anger, not bitterness, but something deeper, something more powerful, a sense of closure waiting to happen, because I knew that this was not just an opportunity to buy a property, it was an opportunity to reclaim a part of my life that had once been taken away from me. And although I had already proven to myself that I could succeed without anyone's approval, this moment felt like the final step in a journey that had started with rejection and pain and transformed into strength and independence. And without fully realizing it at the time, I was standing at the edge of a decision that would not only change my life once again, but would also bring my story full circle in a way that no one, including my family, could have ever expected, because the rise they never saw coming was not just about success. It was about becoming someone they never believed I could. Beta Sweetest Revenge begins with a moment of stillness as I sat staring at the screen where the listing of that house remained open, and for a long time I did nothing, because this was not just a decision about money or property. It was a decision about facing the past that had shaped me into who I had become. Every memory connected to that house slowly surfaced in my mind: the silent dinners, the disappointed looks, the constant comparisons, the night I was told to leave. And as those memories returned, I felt a mix of emotions, not anger, not hatred, but something deeper, something that had taken years to understand. Because the pain I once carried had changed over time. It had softened into clarity, it had turned into strength, and now I was no longer looking at that house as a place of rejection, but as a symbol of how far I had come. I realized that I was not the same person who once walked out of that door with nothing. I was someone who had built a life with his own effort, someone who had turned struggle into growth and doubt into confidence. And as that realization settled within me, the hesitation slowly faded, because this decision was not about proving anything to anyone else. It was about closing a chapter of my life on my own terms, without fear, without regret, and without needing approval from the people who once denied me my worth. So I made the decision quietly, without informing anyone, without creating any drama. I contacted the agent, completed the process, and bought the house legally, fully, and without hesitation. And when everything was finalized, I sat for a moment in silence, taking in the reality of what I had just done, because this was not just a purchase, it was a turning point. It was a moment where the past and present met in a way that felt almost unreal. A week later, I stood in front of the house, the same house that once felt like a prison of expectations, now standing before me as something entirely different, something that belonged to me. And as I looked at it, I felt a calmness that I had never experienced before, not excitement, not pride, but peace, because there was nothing left to prove. The journey had already done its work, and for a few seconds I simply stood there, breathing in the moment before walking toward the door. Each step felt steady, grounded, as if I was not just approaching a building, but reclaiming a part of myself that had been lost years ago. And when I reached the door, I paused briefly before knocking, not out of fear, but out of awareness that this moment would mark the end of something that had once defined me. The door opened, and my father stood there, his expression neutral at first, as he looked at me without recognition. Because time had changed me in ways he could not immediately understand, the uncertainty in his eyes reflected the distance that had grown between us, and for a moment neither of us spoke because there were too many unspoken words, too many memories standing silently between us. He asked if I needed help, his voice calm yet distant, and I responded with a simple sentence that carried more meaning than anything else. I said that I was the new owner, and the confusion on his face was immediate, as if the idea itself was too unexpected to process. My brother appeared behind him, and the moment he saw me his expression shifted from curiosity to shock as realization set in, and my mother followed, standing quietly, her eyes fixed on me as if searching for something familiar in the person I had become. And as I stepped inside the house, the air felt different, not because the place had changed, but because I had changed. Every corner that once held painful memories now felt distant, as if they belonged to another version of me, someone who no longer existed. And I walked through the space calmly, without hesitation, without any trace of the insecurity that once defined me, because I was no longer seeking validation from this place. I was simply acknowledging it as part of my journey. And when I finally spoke, my voice was steady. I told them they would have time to move out, that there was no rush, no pressure, no harshness in my tone, because this was not about revenge in the way they might have expected. There was no desire to hurt them, no intention to make them feel what I once felt, because true growth had changed that part of me completely. And in that moment I understood something important: the strongest form of revenge is not causing pain, it is showing that their judgment was wrong without needing to say it loudly. My father tried to speak but struggled to find words, his silence now carrying the same weight that mine once did. My brother looked away, unable to meet my eyes, and my mother stood there quietly, her expression filled with something I had never seen before, not disappointment, not expectation, but regret, a deep, quiet regret that did not need words to be understood. And for a brief moment I saw them not as the people who had hurt me, but as individuals who had made choices they could not take back. And I felt no anger toward them, only a sense of distance, because the connection that once defined us had already been broken long ago, and there was no need to rebuild it to validate my own growth. As I turned to leave, I paused for a moment, not because I had something to prove, but because there was one final truth I wanted to acknowledge. I told them calmly that they were right about one thing, that I did need to stand on my own feet, and then I added that they were wrong about me, because I was never the failure they believed I was. I was simply someone who had not been given the space to grow until I created it myself. And with that I walked out of the house, not carrying anger, not holding on to the past, but leaving it behind completely, because this was not just the end of a story, it was the beginning of a life that I had built on my own terms, a life defined not by rejection but by resilience, not by judgment but by self-worth. And as I stepped away from the house one last time, I felt a sense of closure that words could not fully capture, because I was no longer the person who had been pushed out into the rain. I was the person who had returned stronger, calmer, and complete. And in that quiet transformation lay the sweetest revenge, not in taking anything from them, but in becoming everything they never believed I could be.